Hey guys, Dave asked about my guitar setup, so here's a video about it. As for my guitar, all of my Nostril Caverns stuff was recorded with a Jackson. It's got the stock EMG pickups in it. I got this guitar for $900 back in 2005, and it still works, so I still use it. It's got a floating bridge, but I put a piece of wood behind it to stop it from moving. For strings, I used the Ernie Ball regular slinky 10 to 46. I tuned it E standard. And the pick, I used the Dunlop nylon 1mm. Here's my amp. It's a Marshall G100R CD. One of the features of it is there's a 1/4 inch female input in the back that you could plug in a CD player. I never use that though. And the speaker is a Marshall MG412 with the 412-inch speakers. I got these new back in 2002, and they still work, so I still use them. This is my guitar pedal. It's a DOD FX7. It's from April '96. You can see it there. I got my first one of these in the late 90s, 98 or 99, but I spilled juice on it in 2003, so I got another one off eBay. I really like the distortion on this. It's and the palm mutes sustain really well. It's really fun for playing old like Slayer type stuff with fast tremolo picking, and I still use it because I like it so much. Now for tones, I only use a few different tones. The one I have set up right now is the constant distortion tone that I used on recent recordings like NR4, NR1, spatial lacerations, self-inflicted memory loss, etc. On the FX7, I used the low compressor just to compress the signal a bit. Distortion, I crank it all the way to 15. That's the highest setting there. The EQ, I use 2, which boosts the low end. By the way, there are no bass guitars on any of my recordings. And the gate, I use a pretty aggressive noise gate for a few reasons. I'm using some really old cables here. They're like 20 years old or more. I should probably get some new ones. And also the original FX7 power supply broke, so instead of buying a new one, I actually had another power supply that matched the voltage where the voltage in the amps matched the FX7, except that it's a PAL Super Nintendo power supply, and that's the European version of the Super Nintendo, which is actually right there. And you can see I'm using the European AC adapter there. So I also use a voltage converter for that, and I think that adds some noise to the signal, which is why I use such an aggressive noise gate. Actually, on some of my recordings, you can hear my pinch harmonics getting prematurely muted because of that. So I should really buy a new FX7 power supply. Now on my amp, for the constant distortion tone, I'll use my normal channel. There's a crunch button here. I press that down, it adds some crunch. For the gain, I'll stick at 5, the bass at 6, middle at 10, treble at 8. I don't use any effects or reverb. And for recording, I'll set the volume at about 1.5, which is still pretty loud. For a separate tone, I'll just use my amp sound. I won't use the FX7. For that tone, I'll keep the crunch button enabled. I'll put the gain at 8, and I'll screw around with the EQ settings. And for that tone, I use that for when I want a more dynamic sound, when I want hard and soft stuff at the same time, So when I play the strings hard, it'll be distorted, and when I play them soft, it'll be clean. I use that tone on vague evolving patterns and track 3, 4, and 5 of Repressed Memory Games. And for another tone that I used a couple times, this was after I broke the power supply of the FX7. I just started using my amp's distortion. I don't like it as much as the FX7, but I'll use the boost channel on my amp, and I used that on Tragic Immoral Illusions and a couple other random songs before I went back to my FX7. For recording guitars, I use a Shure SM57 mic placed in the middle of one of the speakers, and you can see it's pretty close to the grating. And I run that into a Yamaha unit. I use a different unit to record drums, but I use this to record vocals and guitars because it's smaller and I can move around easy. The settings for guitar, I use the second mic input. It's just all raw. I don't use any compression here. The EQs are all in the center. It's just all raw. So I bring the guitars into Reaper. This is NR4, the song I just recorded. There's kick, snare, rack tom, floor tom, left overhead, right overhead, left guitar, right guitar, and the rest are synths, keyboards tracks. I only have 2 guitar tracks. I don't quad track guitars. So with the guitars, I also add a noise gate to the guitars just to get rid of the high-pitched hum or whatever during the muted parts. And the EQ looks like this. I add some low end and then some to the mids and higher mids. And I don't add any compression to the guitars. I do sometimes, like on Spatial Lacerations I did, but I noticed that you can see here the higher spots are the palm mutes. I noticed on Spatial Lacerations the palm mutes sort of lost their heaviness a bit with the added compression. So for this one I tried not adding any compression to the guitars, and I think the palm mutes sound heavier that way. And on the master, I didn't add an EQ, I just added a bit of compression. For the keyboards in NR4, I use a virtual instrument, DSK Overture. You can find that on the DSK website for free. It's a VST that has a bunch of different strings presets. I use the full strings preset, and I record that into Reaper. I physically play the keyboards on my laptop keyboard. I have it set up as a 4-octave music keyboard. I was able to remap the keys. So this bottom row of keys here is the first octave, this next one's the next octave, etc., etc. And the virtual instrument takes up a lot of computer power, so instead of loading the virtual instrument into my original project where the drums and guitar are located, I will I will mix down the drums and guitar. It's the top wave there, and I'll bring it into a new project where I'll put the virtual instrument, and I'll record each chunk of keyboards that I need, and then I'll render just the keyboard track into a wave, and I'll bring that wave into the original project where the drums and guitar are. And one thing about recording this virtual instrument, there's a sound delay, so the sound comes a little after you press the keys. I haven't figured that out, the problem when you're recording, that is. So, and yet when you're done recording and you listen back to what you've just recorded, the sound actually appears too soon. So I have to physically, after each chunk of keyboards that I record, I have to physically go in and move each chunk just a little later so that it syncs back up with the music. So that's my guitar setup. You may have noticed that I'm using some pretty old gear. Truth be told, I'm not that into gear. I'm not that knowledgeable about it. I've only played a few guitars and amps and stuff like that, and if we had a conversation about gear, you'd probably think I was a beginner instead of someone who's played for over 20 years. I just use what I have and try to make it sound how I like it. And I have a really bad case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it.